Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Dr. Ball, you've referenced an IMF study a number of times. Is it fair to assume that the study includes many nations with government workforces that are a larger percent than the U.S.?
Yes.
So then a determination of when you're cutting government spending, that those nations would likely have a higher unemployment because of that, because that spending directly affects the government workforce.
I don't quite think that follows. It's very careful in trying to measure if we have a spending cut of a certain amount, percentage of GDP, what are the average effects on output and unemployment.
What we've seen with our deficit spending over the last few years, generally it's maintaining government employees at the state levels, teachers, others. But it would just seem to me, if your hypothesis is that deficit spending is good for the economy and cutting that spending would cause higher unemployment, that using a study where most of the nations have a greater percent of government workers as part of the workforce, it may not necessarily be accurate. And do you not see the American economy, our free market capitalist system, as somewhat different than most of the other nations of the world?
Well, I mean, this study includes Canada. It includes a variety of most of the world's advanced countries.
Right.
And I think, I mean, that's an interesting thing that they could follow up looking at different types of economies. But I think we're talking here about fairly general principles of economics that I would think would apply to Europe, to Australia, to the U.S.
Well, one of the challenges we have here is I think there are a lot of folks that want us to be more like European economies that are more centrally planned. That's part of our different worldviews that we're dealing with right here. But let me just maybe a question to the whole group, and Mr. Edwards and Dr. Meltzer, maybe I'll go to you first on this. But we're clearly in uncharted territory right now.
Yes.
We can have different opinions about that, but the Federal Reserve interventions are unprecedented. Stimulus spending is at unprecedented levels. The bleak and unsustainable fiscal outlook that we're dealing with is unprecedented. The weak and almost non-existent recovery, despite the incredible levels of stimulus spending, is unprecedented. So how do these factors affect the nearness to the tipping point? And I know we can't determine exactly where that is, but I'm wondering, where are we going to borrow the money from? We're projecting $1 trillion a year about that we have to borrow or print. Where is that going to come from? And aren't we in such uncharted territories now that we need to do more than just sound an alarm, or am I just unnecessarily seeing a bleak situation? And Mr. Edwards, I'll start with you, and Dr. Meltzer, I'd like to get your opinion very quickly too, if I could.
Yeah, I mean, we don't know where the tipping point is, where the next financial crisis is. I mean, recent academic research by Rogoff, Reinhardt, and others point out that different countries are hitting that sort of wall in different sorts of places. As I mentioned, I mean, Japan's debt is 200% of GDP and has been for a couple decades. They're in a unique situation because most of their savings to finance that debt comes domestically. So we're not in that, lucky camp. Our half of our borrowing now comes from abroad. That's a real problem, as the CBO points out in their long-range projections. That means that in the future, if we keep this up, we'll be producing GDP, but a bigger and bigger chunk of that GDP won't be going to Americans. It'll be going to foreign creditors. So that's why our standard of living will be suppressed by this buildup of debt. I must say that, hitting the tipping point that's not the end of the story. Ireland hit the tipping point, but recent news reports are indicating that they've taken some very good policy actions, cutting spending, and they're on the brink of recovery. They're in a much different situation than Greece, even though both of those countries had these massive spikes in debt. Ireland has taken the right policy courses, and they're headed now in the right direction. So, again, I don't think the biggest issue facing you is where the tipping point is. I think it's just, stopping the bleeding as soon as we can.
Dr. Meltzer, quickly, I'm almost out of time, just to comment.
Let me just say that Ireland did not have a large debt. It got a large debt because it assumed the debt of the banking system. The was a private debt. It assumed it as a public debt. That was a huge mistake. Got Ireland in a problem. Take the case of Italy, which is a good case for us to study, because it went along for decades with low growth and high deficits, over 100%. When it joined the ECB, it hid some of its debt, but it basically was over 100% instead of the 60% that was required. Suddenly, that same situation gave rise to a loss of confidence. That was the tipping point.
Yeah.
Why didn't it occur 2 years, 5 years, 10 years earlier? I don't think anyone can answer that.
Thank you. Are you back?
Thank you, Senator. Representative Mulvaney, South